Hey, welcome to the Biochemistry Academy. In today's video, we'll talk about lipoproteins. If you remember, we'll talk about the classification of lipids. Now, lipoproteins is a type of complex lipid. Now, we can define lipoprotein as a macromolecular complex of lipids with proteins. Now, they act as a transport vehicles for lipids in circulation. Now, specific carrier proteins are called apoproteins. Now, these apoproteins bind with lipids to form lipoproteins. Okay, let us talk about the schematic structure of lipoproteins. If we check our diagram, we'll say that it is comprised of phospholipids. And if you remember, we say phospholipid is an amphipathic molecule, meaning that it has a polar region, which is the head, and it also have the non-polar region, which is the tail, that is facing the inner core. And it's also comprised of an unsterified cholesterol. Now, this unsterified cholesterol, it is important to maintain the fluidity of the cell membrane. And if we look at the core, it is hydrophobic in nature, and it is comprised of triglyceride and an esterified cholesterol. Then if we look also, we see that there is an apoprotein there. And this type of apoprotein is an integral apoprotein. Let's talk about the classification of lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are classified based on their size, their composition, and the type of apoprotein that is present. Now, in the first classification of lipoproteins, we have the chylomicrons. They are usually the largest, followed by the VLDL, which is also known as the very low density lipoproteins, followed by the LDL, which is known as the low density lipoprotein. Then we also have the HDL, which is also known as the high density lipoprotein. If we check, the first is the chylomicrons. They are the largest, and they contain the highest concentration of triacylglycerol, followed by the VLDL, which is the very low density lipoprotein. It is large, but is not compared to the size of the chylomicrons, and also has high concentration of triglycerol, followed by the LDL, which is small in size, and it contains the highest concentration of cholesterol. Then the HDL, which is the high density lipoprotein. It is the smallest, and it contains the highest concentration of protein. Now, if we look at each of them, from chylomicrons to HDL, the size decreases, which is the diameter decreases, but the density increases, and the percentage of protein also increases. And that is why we see that the HDL has the highest concentration of protein. Chylomicrons. The chylomicrons is synthesized in the intestine, and it is associated with certain apoprotein like the B48, the E, and the C2. Now, the function of the chylomicrons is that it carries exogenous, which is the dietary triglycerol, from the intestine to the peripheral tissues for utilization, like the skeletal muscles and the adipose tissues. VLDL, which is also known as the very low density lipoproteins. Now, it is synthesized by the liver, and it is associated with certain apoprotein like the B100, the C2, and the E. Now, what is the function of the VLDL is that it carries endogenous triglycerol from the liver to peripheral tissues like the skeletal muscle or adipose tissue. LDL, which is known as the low density lipoproteins. Now, the function of the low density lipoprotein is that it carries cholesterol from the liver to peripheral tissues. The LDL is also called the bad cholesterol. And the reason why it is called the bad cholesterol is that it increases the risk of atherosclerosis. HDL, called the high-density lipoproteins, and it is associated with the apoprotein A1. And the function of the high-density lipoprotein is that it carries cholesterol from the peripheral tissues to the liver. Now, this HDL is also known as good cholesterol. And the reason why it is called the good cholesterol is that it decreases the risk of atherosclerosis.